On a foggy night in Mississippi, 1823, an overseer was walking through the cotton fields when a shot rang out. He fell dead, and his shadow slipped back into the mist. That night marked the beginning of Elijah's hunt. Today, we're going to uncover the story of the hunter of Magnolia Grove. But before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. To understand what drove Elijah to pick up that rifle and begin his campaign of vengeance, one must first comprehend the suffocating brutality that defined every moment of life in the antebellum Deep South. The year 1823 found Mississippi at the height of its cotton boom, when King Cotton ruled with an iron fist and human beings were bought and sold like livestock at markets in Natchez and New Orleans. The Magnolia Grove plantation, owned by Harrison Whitmore III, sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of prime delta land, its fertility watered by the sweat and blood of over 200 enslaved souls. The plantation operated like a small kingdom, with Whitmore as its absolute monarch and a carefully structured hierarchy of overseers, drivers, and field hands beneath him. At the top of this pyramid of oppression stood men like Samuel Garrett, whose job was to extract maximum labor from human property while maintaining the fiction that this system was somehow divinely ordained. Below them were the drivers, typically enslaved men themselves, who were given small privileges in exchange for enforcing discipline among their fellow bondsmen. And at the bottom were the field hands, who rose before dawn and worked until darkness fell, their lives measured in cotton bolls picked and lashes avoided. It was into this hell that Elijah had been born 32 years earlier, on a smaller plantation in Georgia, before being sold to Whitmore when his previous master fell into debt. Tall and lean, with hands scarred by decades of cotton thorns, and a face that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts, Elijah had learned early that survival depended on making himself invisible. He spoke little, observed much, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to move through the plantation grounds without being noticed. While other slaves gathered in the evenings to share stories or sing the coded spirituals that carried messages of hope and resistance, Elijah sat apart, his dark eyes watching, calculating, remembering every cruelty he witnessed. The instruments of oppression surrounded them daily, like a reminder of their powerlessness. Iron shackles hung from posts in the punishment yard, their surfaces worn smooth by countless wrists and ankles. Whips of braided leather cracked in the morning air as overseers demonstrated their authority. The rifles that the white men carried were perhaps the most potent symbol of all. Instruments that could end a life from a distance, that made resistance seem futile, that reminded every enslaved person that they lived or died at the whim of their captors. But it was the blood-stained accounting books that truly revealed the horror of the system. In neat columns, Whitmore and his overseers recorded their human inventory, age, condition, estimated value, productivity ratings. Elijah had seen these books during his brief stints working in the main house, had watched as the masters calculated profit margins while discussing the best methods for breaking a rebellious spirit or maximizing output from pregnant women. To them, the enslaved were nothing more than numbers on a ledger, their suffering as abstract as rainfall measurements or commodity prices. For Elijah, this mathematical dehumanization became personal in the spring of 1822, when he was permitted to marry Keturah, a young woman who worked in the plantation's vegetable gardens. It was one of the few moments of joy in his carefully guarded existence, a brief glimpse of what life might be like if he were truly free. Their cabin became a sanctuary where they could speak in whispers about dreams of escape, where Keturah's laughter could briefly chase away the darkness that had settled over Elijah's soul. When she became pregnant that summer, he dared to imagine a future where their child might know something other than bondage. But masters rarely allowed such happiness to flourish among their property. In October of that year, a cotton shipment came up short, and Whitmore decided that someone needed to be made an example of to prevent future theft. His suspicion fell on Keturah, who had been seen near the weighing station earlier that day. The accusation was baseless. The cotton had likely been miscounted or blown away by wind, But truth was irrelevant when discipline needed to be maintained. What happened next was seared into Elijah's memory with the permanence of a brand. Whitmore ordered Keturah tied to the whipping post in the main yard, where all the slaves were forced to watch. Even though she was 6 months pregnant, even though she proclaimed her innocence with tears streaming down her face, the lash fell again and again until she collapsed unconscious. But Whitmore wasn't finished. He ordered her moved to the stocks, where she was left without food or water for 2 days under the scorching October sun. Elijah begged on his knees for mercy. He offered to take double lashes himself. He promised to work extra hours, to give up his meager food rations, to do anything if only they would spare his wife and unborn child. But his pleas fell on ears that heard only the sound of property making noise. Whitmore's response was to have Elijah shackled and forced to watch as his wife slowly died of dehydration and infection, her belly still swollen with their child who would never draw breath. The funeral was held at dawn, without ceremony or even a proper grave marker. As they lowered Keturah's body and that of their stillborn son into the red delta clay, something died in Elijah as well. But something else was born in that moment, a cold, patient rage that would burn like a banked fire for months to come. He had learned that mercy was a luxury that masters never extended to their property. He had learned that justice would never come from above. And most importantly, he had learned that the only language these men truly understood was fear. In the months that followed, Elijah retreated further into himself, becoming even more invisible than ever before. But this was not the invisibility of submission. It was the invisibility of a predator studying its prey. He observed the patterns of the overseers, noting when they made their rounds and which paths they preferred. He memorized the layout of every building, every hiding place, every escape route on the plantation. He studied the habits of Harrison Whitmore himself, watching from the shadows as the master took his evening walks or visited his mistress in the quarters. Other slaves began to notice changes in Elijah, though they couldn't quite name what was different. He moved with a new purposefulness, like a man who had found his calling. His eyes had taken on an intensity that made even the bravest among them uneasy. Some whispered that he no longer slept at night, that he could be seen walking the plantation grounds in the hours before dawn, silent as smoke. Others claimed he had developed an uncanny ability to appear and disappear without warning, materializing beside you when you thought you were alone, vanishing into thin air when the overseers approached.
The opportunity that would change everything came during a drunken celebration in late September 1823. Several overseers had been sampling Whitmore's bourbon in honor of a particularly profitable cotton sale, and their revelry had continued long into the night. By 3 in the morning, most had passed out in various states of undress around the overseers' quarters, their weapons scattered carelessly about like discarded toys. Elijah had been watching from the cover of the cotton rows, patient as death itself. When the last man finally succumbed to alcohol and exhaustion, he moved with the fluid silence that had become his trademark. Among the debris of the celebration, he found what he had been hoping for: a rifle that had been carelessly propped against a chair, its owner too drunk to remember its location. The weapon was a .54 caliber Kentucky long rifle, well maintained and loaded, with a powder horn and shot pouch nearby. As his fingers closed around the stock, Elijah felt the balance of power shift in ways that went beyond the physical weight of the weapon. For the first time in his life, he held in his hands the means to strike back at his oppressors on equal terms. The rifle was more than just a tool of violence. It was an equalizer, a way to project force from a distance, to become the hunter rather than the hunted. In that moment, 32 years of accumulated rage found its instrument. He secreted the rifle in a hollow cypress tree deep in the swamps that bordered the plantation, along with ammunition he gradually stole over the following weeks. The weapon became his obsession, his secret companion in the campaign he was planning. During his few free hours on Sundays, he would slip away to practice with it, learning its quirks and capabilities, becoming as familiar with its operation as he was with the cotton plants he tended daily. The rifle had a hair trigger and pulled slightly to the left, details that might mean the difference between life and death when the moment came to use it in anger. October brought the harvest season, when the entire plantation worked from dawn to dusk, bringing in the cotton that would make Whitmore rich for another year. It was also hunting season, when the masters would organize expeditions into the surrounding woods to kill deer and wild boar. The sound of gunshots echoing across the delta became commonplace, providing perfect cover for what Elijah had in mind. His first target was carefully chosen. Marcus Reed was one of Whitmore's younger overseers, a man in his early 30s who had developed a reputation for particular cruelty toward women. Reed lived alone in a small cabin on the plantation's eastern boundary, and he had a habit of taking solitary rides along the river road each evening to visit a widow in the neighboring county. These rides followed a predictable pattern, with Reed always passing through a stretch of woods about 2 miles from the main plantation buildings. Elijah spent a week studying Reed's routine, timing his movements, identifying the perfect spot for an ambush. He chose a bend in the road where ancient live oaks formed a natural blind, their Spanish moss hanging like curtains that could conceal a marksman. The location offered multiple escape routes and was far enough from the plantation that the sound of a gunshot might be mistaken for hunters pursuing game. On October 15th, as the sun began to set behind the cotton fields, Marcus Reed mounted his horse for his usual evening ride. He was in good spirits, humming a popular tune as he guided his mount along the familiar path. The day had gone well. He had managed to squeeze an extra 200 pounds of cotton from his crew through judicious use of the whip, and Whitmore had commended him for his efficiency. As he entered the stretch of woods, Reed was already thinking about the warm welcome that awaited him at his destination. He never saw the figure that rose from behind the moss-draped oak, never heard the careful aim being taken, never felt the rifle ball that shattered his spine and dropped him from the saddle like a sack of grain. His horse, trained to gunfire from hunting expeditions, barely startled before bolting down the road with empty stirrups hanging in the evening air. Elijah watched from his hiding place as Reed's body twitched once and then lay still. There was no satisfaction in the kill, no moment of triumph or closure. This was simply the first payment on a debt that could never be fully settled, the opening move in a campaign that would continue until either justice was served or death claimed him. He reloaded methodically, cleaned the rifle barrel, and melted back into the swamp as silently as he had emerged. Marcus Reed's body was discovered the following morning by a slave hunting runaway hogs. The bullet had struck him in the back, and the powder burns on his clothing suggested the shot had been fired from close range by someone who knew how to handle a rifle. The local sheriff was summoned from Natchez, but his investigation revealed little beyond the obvious. Reed had been murdered by someone with military precision and woodcraft skills.
Harrison Whitmore called a meeting of neighboring planters to discuss security measures. They agreed to increase patrols, travel in groups, and offer a substantial reward for information leading to the killer's capture. Wanted posters began appearing in towns throughout the region, though they could only describe a phantom, someone who struck without warning and disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only death and fear. What they didn't realize was that their killer lived among them, hiding in plain sight as he had for his entire life. Elijah continued his daily routine without the slightest change in behavior, picking cotton with the same methodical efficiency he had always shown, accepting orders with the same apparent submission, maintaining the mask of servility that had protected him for 3 decades. To his fellow slaves, he seemed unchanged, except for a subtle alteration in his posture, a new confidence in his movements that suggested inner reserves of strength they had never suspected.
But those who knew him best began to notice small changes. His appetite had diminished, and he often stared into the distance with the intensity of a man seeing visions. Sometimes he would disappear for hours at a time, returning with mud on his clothes and scratches on his hands that suggested journeys through difficult terrain. Most telling of all, he had begun to hum, barely audible melodies that seemed to carry hidden meanings, like the coded spirituals that had always been used to pass messages among the enslaved. The second killing came 3 weeks later, under circumstances that would become the stuff of legend in slave quarters throughout the Delta. Jonathan Kress was Whitmore's head overseer, a burly man in his 40s who carried a reputation for savage efficiency that extended far beyond Magnolia Grove. He had been invited to speak at a gathering of planters in Vicksburg about labor management techniques, and he was riding home alone through the cypress swamps when death found him. Kress was no fool. He had heard about Reed's murder and had taken precautions, carrying 2 loaded pistols and varying his route home from previous trips. But Elijah had been tracking his movements for days, studying his habits with the patience of a born hunter. He knew that Kress would have to cross Beaver Creek at a particular ford, and he knew that his horse had a tendency to shy at sudden noises. The ambush site was perfect. A fallen log provided cover while offering a clear field of fire across the shallow creek. Spanish moss draped the surrounding trees like funeral shrouds, creating a maze of shadows that would conceal movement. Most importantly, the location was miles from the nearest plantation, ensuring that no one would hear the shot or arrive to investigate for hours. Elijah had been waiting in position since before dawn, motionless as the morning mist rose from the water and the first light filtered through the canopy. He had learned patience from 32 years of bondage, had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. When Kress finally appeared on the far side of the creek, his horse picking its way carefully across the rocky ford, the rifle was already trained on the center of his chest. The shot echoed across the swamp like thunder, sending flights of egret spiraling into the air and causing alligators to slip quickly beneath the surface. Kress toppled backward from his saddle, his body splashing into the shallow water as his horse reared and bolted. Blood began to color the creek around his body, attracting clouds of insects and the first tentative approaches of scavengers from the depths of the swamp. This time Elijah lingered for a moment to study his handiwork. Kress had been the man who held the whip when Keturah died, who had ignored her pleas for water as she hung dying in the stocks. His death was particularly sweet, a form of communion between the living and the dead that brought Elijah closer to his murdered family. But again, there was no sense of completion, no feeling that justice had been served. This was merely another installment on an infinite debt. The discovery of Kress's body 3 days later sent panic rippling through the planter community. 2 overseers dead in less than a month, both killed by someone who possessed military skills and intimate knowledge of local terrain. The murders were clearly connected, and the precision of the attacks suggested they were dealing with something far more dangerous than random violence. This was systematic, purposeful, and worst of all, it showed no signs of stopping. Harrison Whitmore doubled the guards around his plantation and sent word to New Orleans requesting military assistance. He also began sleeping with loaded weapons beside his bed and refused to travel anywhere without an armed escort. Other planters took similar precautions, turning their grand houses into armed camps and viewing every shadow with suspicion. The easy confidence that had once characterized their dominion over the Delta was rapidly eroding, replaced by a paranoia that infected every aspect of their daily lives. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the change in attitude among the enslaved population. Where once there had been resignation and despair, now there was something that looked suspiciously like hope. Slaves who had previously moved through their duties with downcast eyes now carried themselves with subtle dignity. Conversations that had once focused on survival now included whispered speculations about deliverance. Most disturbing of all, discipline problems were increasing, as field hands grew emboldened by the knowledge that their oppressors were no longer invincible. The masters responded to this shift with increased brutality, but their efforts only served to fuel the underground fires that were beginning to burn throughout the region. Each new punishment, each arbitrary cruelty, each demonstration of power served to reinforce the message that Elijah's rifle was delivering. The system that had seemed eternal and unbreakable was actually fragile and mortal. Men who had presented themselves as gods were revealing themselves to be merely men, capable of bleeding and dying like any other creature.
November brought colder weather and longer nights, conditions that favored a hunter who knew how to move unseen through hostile territory. Elijah had grown bolder in his movements, ranging farther from the plantation and taking greater risks in pursuit of his quarry. His next target would be the most ambitious yet, Dr. Nathaniel Brooks, a respected physician who supplemented his medical practice by purchasing slaves in New Orleans and reselling them to Delta planters at substantial profits. Brooks was scheduled to arrive at Magnolia Grove on November 20th to examine a shipment of new slaves that Whitmore was considering purchasing. The doctor made this trip monthly, always traveling the same route from Natchez and always stopping for the night at the same inn in Washington, Mississippi. His carriage was well appointed and his driver was armed, but Brooks himself was old and soft, a man who had grown wealthy from human misery but had never faced physical danger in his comfortable life. The attack came at dawn as Brooks's carriage approached the final stretch of road leading to Magnolia Grove. Elijah had spent the night hidden in a drainage ditch beside the road, covered by fallen leaves and as motionless as death itself. As the carriage rounded a bend where the road passed between two ancient oaks, he rose like an avenging spirit and fired through the window at point-blank range. The bullet took Brooks in the head, killing him instantly and spraying blood across the fine leather upholstery of his carriage. His driver, a free black man named Thomas, who had served the doctor faithfully for 20 years, was so startled by the sudden attack that he nearly lost control of the horses. By the time he had regained his composure and looked around for the shooter, there was nothing to see but empty fields and morning mist. Thomas drove the carriage with its gruesome cargo straight to Magnolia Grove, where the sight of the respected doctor's corpse sent Harrison Whitmore into a rage that could be heard across the plantation. This was no longer just an attack on overseers and hired help. This was a direct assault on the entire social order that kept men like Whitmore in power. The killer had escalated his campaign to include the professional class that provided essential services to the plantation system, suggesting a level of strategic thinking that chilled the master's blood. Whitmore immediately dispatched riders to spread word of the latest killing throughout the Delta region. By evening, every planter within 50 miles knew that Dr. Brooks had been murdered in broad daylight within sight of one of the most secure plantations in Mississippi. The psychological impact was devastating. If someone could kill a respected physician traveling in an armed carriage on a well-traveled road, then no one was safe anywhere at any time. The response was swift and brutal. Whitmore organized a search of every slave cabin on his plantation, looking for weapons or any other evidence that might point to the killer's identity. When nothing was found, he ordered 10 slaves whipped at random as a warning to potential conspirators. Similar searches and punishments were carried out on plantations throughout the region, as masters desperately sought to reassert their authority through displays of savage force. But the violence only served to underscore their vulnerability. Each lash of the whip, each arbitrary punishment, each demonstration of power was actually an admission of weakness. The masters were lashing out blindly because they were afraid, and their fear was as obvious to their slaves as blood in water is to sharks. The underground networks that connected slave communities across the Delta began buzzing with coded messages, shared songs, and meaningful glances that spoke of coming changes. Elijah watched these developments with the satisfaction of a master strategist seeing his plans unfold perfectly. He had understood from the beginning that his campaign was as much psychological as physical, that terror was a force multiplier that could amplify the impact of each individual killing far beyond its immediate effects. By targeting figures of authority and demonstrating that the master's power was illusory, he was systematically undermining the foundations of the system that had enslaved him. But he also knew that his time was short. Each attack increased the attention focused on his activities, and sooner or later, someone would make the connections that would expose him. The search parties were getting larger and more thorough, the security measures more comprehensive, the rewards for information more tempting. He would need to accelerate his timeline and take greater risks if he hoped to complete his mission of vengeance before they closed the net around him. December arrived with unseasonable warmth and heavy rains that turned the Delta roads into rivers of mud. The weather provided both opportunities and challenges for a man trying to move unseen through hostile territory. Elijah adapted his methods accordingly, using the weather as both camouflage and weapon in his ongoing campaign. His next target was perhaps the most symbolically important yet: Judge Cornelius Hawthorne, who presided over the county courthouse in Natchez and whose interpretations of slave law had sent dozens of runaways back to lives of bondage and torture. Hawthorne was scheduled to hear a case involving a disputed slave sale at Magnolia Grove, and he would be staying overnight at Whitmore's as his honored guest.
The judge arrived on December 10th in a show of pomp and ceremony designed to reinforce the majesty of white law. His carriage was followed by an armed escort, and he was greeted at the main house by a gathering of local dignitaries who had come to pay their respects. A grand dinner was planned for that evening, with entertainment provided by the plantation's most skilled musicians and dancers, all of them slaves who would perform for the amusement of the men who owned them like livestock. Elijah had anticipated this opportunity for weeks, studying the layout of the main house and identifying the room where important guests were typically lodged. He knew that Hawthorne would be staying in the northeast corner room on the second floor, with windows that faced the garden where Keturah had once tended vegetables before her murder. The symbolism was perfect. The man who had legitimized slavery through legal interpretation would die in sight of the place where slavery had claimed its most precious victim. The attack came at midnight, after the dinner guests had retired and the house had settled into sleep. Elijah had spent hours working his way across the plantation grounds, moving from shadow to shadow with the patience he had learned from 3 decades of bondage. The main house was guarded, but the sentries were focused on the approaches rather than the gardens, and Elijah knew every inch of the terrain from his years of working around the buildings. He positioned himself beneath an ancient magnolia tree whose branches reached almost to the second-floor window of the judge's room. The climbing was difficult and dangerous, requiring him to move with absolute silence while carrying his rifle and ammunition. Spanish moss provided concealment, but the bark was slick with rain, and one misstep would mean discovery and certain death. Judge Hawthorne was reading by candlelight when the rifle barrel appeared at his window. He looked up from his law books just in time to see death staring at him through the glass, too shocked to cry out before the bullet took him in the chest. The sound of breaking glass mingled with the sharp crack of gunpowder as Hawthorne toppled from his chair, blood spreading across the legal documents that had been the instruments of so much suffering. Elijah was already scrambling down the tree when the screaming began inside the house. Lights appeared in windows as the household awakened to chaos, and he could hear Harrison Whitmore's voice bellowing orders to his men. But the killer was already disappearing into the maze of outbuildings and slave quarters, using routes he had planned and practiced for exactly such a moment. By the time the search parties were organized, he had vanished into the night like smoke dispersing in wind. The murder of Judge Hawthorne sent shockwaves far beyond the Mississippi Delta. Here was a man who represented the very foundations of law and order in the antebellum South, killed in the home of one of the region's most prominent planters despite heavy security. Newspaper accounts of the killing appeared in cities from New Orleans to Richmond, each one adding to the growing legend of a phantom assassin who could strike anywhere at anyone. More importantly for the local slave community, the judge's death demonstrated that no level of white authority was immune from retribution. If judges could be killed, if overseers could be hunted down like animals, if respected doctors could be murdered in daylight broadlight, then perhaps the entire system of bondage was not as eternal and unbreakable as it had seemed. Hope began to flicker in hearts where it had been extinguished for generations, and that hope translated into subtle changes in behavior that made masters throughout the region increasingly nervous. Harrison Whitmore was now operating his plantation in a state of virtual siege. Armed guards patrolled the grounds day and night, and no white man traveled anywhere alone. Business meetings that had once been conducted in comfortable parlors now took place in locked rooms with weapons close at hand. The easy confidence that had once characterized the master class was being replaced by a paranoia that infected every aspect of their lives. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the growing realization that their enemy was not some external threat that could be hunted down and eliminated. The precision of the attacks, the intimate knowledge of local terrain and routines, the ability to appear and disappear without trace, all of these factors pointed to someone who lived among them, who knew their habits and vulnerabilities because he observed them daily. The killer was not just hunting them, he was one of their own slaves, a piece of human property that had somehow transformed itself into an instrument of divine retribution. This realization led to increasingly desperate measures as masters throughout the Delta struggled to identify the threat in their midst. Slave quarters were searched repeatedly, informants were recruited with promises of freedom or punishment, and suspected troublemakers were sold away to plantations in distant states. The climate of suspicion and fear began to tear apart the social fabric that had held the plantation system together, as masters found themselves unable to trust anyone with dark skin. Elijah watched these developments with growing satisfaction, even as he recognized that time was shortening. Each day brought new security measures, new searches, new attempts to trap him. Several times he had been forced to abandon planned attacks when the risks became too great, and he knew that eventually his luck would run out. But there was still one target that he was determined to reach before that happened: Harrison Whitmore himself, the master of Magnolia Grove, who had become increasingly reclusive since the judge's murder, rarely leaving his heavily fortified mansion and never traveling without an armed escort of at least 6 men. He had also begun sleeping in different rooms each night, trying to establish an unpredictable pattern that would make it difficult for an assassin to plan an attack. but Whitmore's precautions were based on the assumption that his enemy was someone from outside the plantation, not someone who had been observing his habits for years and who had access to the most intimate details of his daily routine.
Elijah knew, for example, that Whitmore suffered from insomnia and often stood on his bedroom balcony in the early morning hours, looking out over the plantation that had made him wealthy. He knew that the master had a particular fondness for bourbon, and that heavy drinking often made him careless about security procedures. Most importantly, he knew that Whitmore's arrogance would eventually overcome his caution, leading him to take risks that would create opportunities for revenge. That opportunity came on December 23rd, when word arrived that a potential buyer from Louisiana was interested in purchasing a large number of slaves for a sugar plantation near Baton Rouge. Despite the dangerous situation, Whitmore's greed overcame his fear, and he began preparing for negotiations that could net him thousands of dollars in profit. The meeting was scheduled for the evening of Christmas Eve, when the buyer would inspect the available merchandise and discuss terms. Elijah spent the day in careful preparation, cleaning his rifle and counting his remaining ammunition. He had perhaps a dozen shots left, more than enough for what he had planned, but not enough for a sustained battle if things went wrong. He also spent time in prayer, not to the white man's God who had sanctioned slavery, but to the spirits of his ancestors who had died in bondage and whose suffering demanded retribution. As evening approached, he felt the presence of Keturah and their unborn child, guiding his steps toward the final confrontation. The buyer never arrived. Whether he had been delayed by weather, warned off by reports of violence, or was simply a fiction created by Whitmore's paranoid imagination was never determined. But his absence created an opportunity that Elijah had not dared to hope for. Disappointed and angry, Harrison Whitmore III dismissed most of his guards early and retired to his study to drink away his frustration. By midnight, he was alone on his second-floor balcony, staring out over the plantation grounds with the unfocused gaze of a man deep in his cups. Elijah had been waiting in the garden below for over an hour, hidden among the same vegetable beds where Keturah had once worked. The positioning was perfect, close enough for an accurate shot, concealed by shadows and foliage, with multiple escape routes that he had memorized through years of careful observation. As Whitmore appeared on the balcony, outlined against the light from his study windows, the killer raised his rifle and took careful aim at the center of his target's chest. The lanterns flickered in the gentle breeze, casting dancing shadows across the balcony and making precise aiming difficult. Elijah waited patiently for the light to steady, knowing that he would have only one chance and that everything depended on making this shot count. When the flame finally stabilized, he could see Whitmore clearly, a soft, pale figure in a white nightshirt, swaying slightly from drink and completely unaware of the death that was about to claim him. The rifle bucked against Elijah's shoulder as the shot echoed across the plantation grounds. Through the cloud of powder smoke, he saw Harrison Whitmore III stagger backward against the French doors of his study, his hands clutching at the spreading bloodstain on his chest. The master's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air, before his legs gave way and he collapsed onto the balcony floor. Screams erupted from inside the house as Whitmore's family discovered his body. Lights began appearing in windows throughout the plantation as slaves and overseers alike awakened to the sound of chaos. But Elijah was already moving, disappearing into the maze of outbuildings and cotton rows that he knew better than any pursuing force ever could. Behind him, the great house burned with lights and rang with voices raised in panic and confusion. But ahead lay only darkness and the promise of escape. The master of Magnolia Grove was dead, shot down on his own balcony like a common criminal. The man who had ordered Keturah's torture and death, who had treated human beings like livestock, who had grown rich from the suffering of others, had finally faced judgment for his crimes. Justice had been served by a slave's hand.
delivered by a rifle stolen from his own overseers, paid for with bullets meant to keep his property in line. As Elijah melted into the reeds and mist of the Delta swampland, he left behind a plantation in chaos and a way of life forever changed. The masters who had once walked with confidence of Dodds now trembled at every shadow, knowing that death could find them anywhere, at any time, delivered by hands they had never bothered to see as human. The balance of power that had seemed eternal and unbreakable had shifted in ways that would echo through generations, all because one man had refused to accept that his wife and child's deaths would go unavenged. The killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Harrison Whitmore's death marked the end of Elijah's campaign of vengeance, though no one knew it at the time. For weeks after the master's murder, plantation owners throughout the Delta continued to live in a state of siege, expecting each dawn to bring news of another killing. Armed patrols scoured the countryside, bloodhounds tracked phantom scents through cypress swamps, and rewards totaling thousands of dollars were offered for information leading to the assassin's capture. But the phantom had vanished as completely as morning mist, leaving behind only questions and the lingering fear that he might strike again without warning.
Captain Marcus Thornton, the officer in charge of the investigation, was a veteran of the War of 1812 who had spent years hunting Seminole warriors through the Florida Everglades. He understood guerrilla warfare and unconventional tactics better than most, and he immediately grasped that they were dealing with someone who possessed sophisticated military skills. The precision of the attacks, the strategic selection of targets, the ability to appear and disappear without trace, all of these factors suggested a level of planning and execution that went far beyond simple murder. "This is not random violence," Thornton wrote in his official report to military headquarters in New Orleans. "We are dealing with an individual who has conducted a systematic campaign of terror against the plantation system. The attacks show clear evidence of military training, intimate knowledge of local terrain, and access to detailed intelligence about his target's movements and habits. Most disturbing of all, the killer has demonstrated an ability to blend seamlessly into the local population, suggesting he may be hiding among the very slaves he appears to be fighting to liberate." The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Similar killings had been reported across the Deep South over the past several years, always following the same methodical approach: careful target selection, precise execution, and complete disappearance of the perpetrator. Overseers had been found shot dead in Georgia, slave dealers murdered in their carriages in Alabama, and plantation owners killed in their own homes in Louisiana. What had seemed like isolated incidents now appeared to be part of a coordinated campaign that spanned multiple states and had been ongoing for far longer than anyone had realized. More troubling still were the psychological effects the killings were having on the enslaved population throughout the region. Military observers reported subtle but significant changes in behavior among slaves on plantations across the Delta. Work songs had taken on new meanings, with coded messages that seemed to celebrate recent events. Discipline problems were increasing as field hands grew emboldened by the knowledge that their oppressors were vulnerable. Most importantly, escape attempts were rising dramatically as slaves began to believe that freedom might actually be achievable. The military response was swift and brutal. Martial law was declared across 3 counties, with curfews imposed and freedom of movement severely restricted for all black residents, free and enslaved alike. Suspected troublemakers were arrested and interrogated using methods that would have shocked civilized observers. Informants were recruited through a combination of promised rewards and threatened punishments, creating a network of surveillance that extended into every slave quarter in the region. But despite these efforts, no credible leads emerged. The killer had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind no physical evidence, no reliable witnesses, no trail that the most experienced trackers could follow. It was as if the Delta swamps had simply swallowed him whole, claiming another victim for their muddy depths. The investigation continued for months, consuming vast resources and manpower, but ultimately yielded nothing more substantial than rumors and speculation. What had become of Elijah remained one of the great mysteries of the antebellum period. Official records from the period show no arrest, no trial, no confession that would explain his fate. The military files contain dozens of theories, but no definitive answers. Some investigators believed he had been killed while attempting to escape, his body lost in the treacherous swampland that bordered the Mississippi River. Others suggested he had fled north along the Underground Railroad, perhaps eventually reaching Canada or the Free States, where he could disappear into communities of escaped slaves and abolitionists. The most intriguing theory, supported by scattered evidence from multiple sources, was that Elijah had joined one of the Maroon communities that existed in the most remote regions of the Delta. These were settlements of escaped slaves who had carved out hidden enclaves in areas so inaccessible that even determined search parties rarely found them. The Maroons lived by hunting, fishing, and small-scale agriculture, supporting themselves through knowledge of the land that had been passed down through generations of fugitives. Several military patrols reported encounters with armed black men in the deep swamps, individuals who demonstrated military skills and weapons proficiency that suggested formal training. These encounters were brief and violent, with the mysterious fighters disappearing into terrain that pursuing soldiers found impassable. Local slaves, when questioned about these incidents, claimed no knowledge of such groups, but their denials carried an undertone that suggested they knew more than they were willing to reveal. Dr. Emmanuel Rousseau, a French naturalist who spent months exploring the Delta region in 1824, wrote extensively about rumors of hidden settlements deep in the cypress swamps. The slaves speak in whispers of communities that exist beyond the reach of white authority. They tell stories of men who have thrown off their chains and now live as free as their ancestors in Africa. Whether these tales are based in reality or are simply wishful thinking born of desperation, I cannot say. But there is something in the way these stories are told, with such specific detail and obvious belief, that suggests they may contain more truth than the authorities are willing to acknowledge. The impact of Elijah's campaign extended far beyond the immediate victims of his rifle. The psychological wounds he inflicted on the plantation system proved far more lasting than the physical deaths he caused. The masters who had once ruled their domains with absolute confidence now lived in constant fear, seeing potential assassins in every shadow and hearing threats in every whisper. The easy assumptions about racial superiority and the natural order of slavery had been shattered by the demonstration that a slave could successfully hunt and kill his oppressors with systematic precision. This fear translated into increasingly harsh measures designed to prevent similar uprisings. New laws were passed restricting slave movement, prohibiting gatherings, and mandating severe punishments for any sign of defiance. The few privileges that had previously been allowed, such as Sunday gatherings, music sessions, and limited travel between plantations, were curtailed or eliminated entirely. The masters' response to their terror was to tighten their grip on power, but these measures only served to demonstrate how fragile their control had always been. The economic consequences were equally significant. Insurance rates for plantation properties skyrocketed as companies recognized the new risks associated with slave-based agriculture. Potential investors became reluctant to put money into ventures that could be destroyed by a single determined individual with military skills. Most importantly, the steady flow of new slaves from Africa and the Caribbean began to slow as traders recognized that their human cargo might include individuals capable of organizing deadly resistance.
For the enslaved population throughout the South, Elijah's campaign served as proof that their situation was not hopeless, that resistance was possible, and that their oppressors were mortal men who could bleed and die like anyone else. The stories of his exploits spread through the underground networks that connected slave communities across the region, growing in the telling until they took on almost mythical proportions. He became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even the most complete system of oppression could not completely crush the human spirit. These psychological effects manifested in numerous ways over the years that followed. Escape attempts increased dramatically throughout the Deep South as slaves became convinced that freedom was achievable for those willing to take sufficient risks. Sabotage incidents rose as field hands found subtle ways to damage equipment, spoil crops, and disrupt the smooth operation of plantation agriculture. Most significantly, the network of informants and overseers that masters depended on to maintain control became increasingly unreliable as the enslaved population developed new loyalties and solidarities. The religious implications of Elijah's campaign were equally profound. Many slaves interpreted his success as evidence of divine intervention, believing that God had finally sent a deliverer to punish their oppressors and point the way toward freedom. Spirituals composed during this period reflect these themes, with references to biblical figures like Moses and Joshua, who had led their people out of bondage and into the Promised Land. The image of the righteous warrior striking down the ungodly became a powerful symbol in slave Christianity, one that would influence religious thought and African American communities for generations to come. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the national conversation about slavery itself. Reports of the Delta killings reached newspapers throughout the country, where they were interpreted through the lens of sectional politics and moral arguments about human bondage. Abolitionists pointed to Elijah's campaign as evidence that slavery was inherently unstable and dangerous, a system that inevitably produced the violence it claimed to prevent. Defenders of slavery used the same events to argue for more stringent controls and harsher punishments, claiming that only firm discipline could prevent such outrages. The debate raged in legislative chambers, church pulpits, and newspaper editorial pages from Maine to Georgia. Congressmen cited the Delta murders when arguing for or against the expansion of slavery into new territories. Ministers used them as examples in sermons about divine justice and human dignity. Writers and poets found in Elijah's story raw material for explorations of themes like freedom, vengeance, and moral responsibility that would influence American literature for decades to come. By 1825, the immediate crisis had passed, but its effects continued to reverberate throughout Southern society. The military occupation gradually ended as federal authorities concluded that the immediate threat had been eliminated, but local militias remained on high alert for months afterward. Plantation owners continued to live with heightened security measures, and the easy confidence that had once characterized their dominance was never fully restored. New institutions emerged to address the perceived threats to the plantation system. Slave patrols were formalized and expanded, creating semi-military organizations dedicated to monitoring the movements of enslaved populations. Communication networks were established between plantations to share information about suspicious activities or potential troublemakers. Most significantly, a new class of professional slave catchers emerged, men who specialized in tracking down runaways and eliminating threats to the established order. These measures succeeded in preventing any repetition of Elijah's campaign, but they came at enormous cost to the masters themselves. The system they had created to ensure their comfort and prosperity now demanded constant vigilance, perpetual fear, and ever-increasing levels of violence to maintain. The easy profits of slave-based agriculture were offset by the costs of security, surveillance, and military preparedness. Most importantly, the moral justifications for slavery became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of evidence that the system required such extreme measures to survive. For the enslaved communities throughout the South, life after Elijah became both more dangerous and more hopeful. The increased surveillance and harsh punishments made open resistance extremely risky, but the knowledge that successful defiance was possible sustained spirits that might otherwise have been crushed by despair. Underground networks became more sophisticated, developing coded languages and secret practices that allowed communication and coordination despite the constant threat of discovery. The stories of Elijah's campaign became part of the oral tradition that preserved African American culture through the darkest periods of bondage. Parents told their children about the slave who had stolen a rifle and hunted down his masters, emphasizing the themes of courage, justice, and eventual liberation that sustained hope through generations of suffering. These stories evolved and changed over time, but their essential message remained constant. Oppression was not eternal, and those who perpetrated cruelty would eventually face judgment for their crimes. As the decades passed and the United States moved inexorably toward civil war, the memory of Elijah's campaign took on prophetic significance. Abolitionists cited it as evidence that slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction, that a system based on violence and oppression would inevitably produce violent resistance. When John Brown attempted his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, many observers drew parallels to the Delta killings, seeing both as examples of how individual acts of defiance could challenge entire systems of oppression.
But even after emancipation, the legacy of Elijah's campaign continued to influence American society in profound ways. The methods he had used, careful planning, strategic targeting, psychological warfare, and intimate knowledge of enemy weaknesses, became models for later resistance movements throughout the world. His story inspired generations of freedom fighters who faced seemingly impossible odds, demonstrating that determined individuals could challenge even the most complete systems of oppression. The mystery of his ultimate fate only enhanced his symbolic power. Because no one knew for certain whether he had died in the swamps, escaped to freedom, or simply melted back into the enslaved population to await another opportunity, he remained a perpetual possibility, a reminder that resistance could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Every suspicious death, every act of sabotage, every unexplained disappearance carried the suggestion that perhaps Elijah had returned, or that others had taken up his mission of vengeance and liberation. Modern historians who have studied the fragmentary records of his campaign continue to debate fundamental questions about his identity, motivations, and ultimate fate. Some argue that Elijah was actually several different individuals whose actions were conflated by frightened witnesses and sensational newspaper accounts. Others suggest that the entire story was exaggerated or fabricated, a myth created to explain random violence that had no deeper significance. But the weight of evidence, from military records to slave testimonies to contemporary newspaper accounts, supports the existence of a single individual who conducted a systematic campaign of assassination against plantation authorities. What cannot be debated is the profound impact his actions had on American society at a critical juncture in its development. At a time when the future of slavery hung in the balance and the nation struggled with fundamental questions about human dignity and natural rights, Elijah's campaign demonstrated that the enslaved were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation. His rifle spoke with a voice that could not be silenced by whips or chains, delivering a message that resonated far beyond the cypress swamps where he made his final stand. The cotton fields where Elijah once labored have long since been reclaimed by the Mississippi River,
their boundaries erased by decades of flooding and channel changes. The great houses where his victims lived and died have mostly crumbled into ruins, their columns overgrown with kudzu and their rooms filled with the accumulated debris of abandonment. But the story of what happened in those dark nights of 1823 continues to echo through American memory, a reminder of truths about power, justice, and human dignity that each generation must learn anew. In the end, Elijah's greatest victory was not the death of any particular master or overseer, but the demonstration that the system they represented was neither natural nor eternal. By picking up that discarded rifle and turning it against his oppressors, he revealed the fundamental weakness at the heart of slavery. It depended entirely on the acquiescence of its victims. When that acquiescence was withdrawn, when the enslaved refused to accept their designated role as property, the entire edifice of bondage became vulnerable to challenge from even a single determined individual. The fog that had rolled across the Delta on that October night in 1823 eventually lifted, but the darkness it concealed had been permanently illuminated. In the muzzle flash of Elisha's rifle, Americans caught a glimpse of truths about their society that many preferred to keep hidden. The comfortable myths about benevolent paternalism and natural racial hierarchies were shattered by the demonstration that those who had been deemed incapable of resistance were actually capable of conducting sophisticated military campaigns against their oppressors. Perhaps most significantly, Elijah's campaign revealed that the violence inherent in slavery would eventually turn back on those who perpetrated it. The whips, chains, and rifles that masters used to maintain their dominance could be seized and turned against them by those who had learned their lessons too well. In teaching their slaves to fear violence, they had also taught them its power. In demonstrating that force was the ultimate arbiter of human relationships, they had provided the justification for their own destruction. As the last echoes of gunfire faded across the Delta and the morning mist rose from the cypress swamps, a new chapter in the American story began. It was a chapter written in blood and shadowed by mystery, but it carried within it the promise of eventual liberation for all those who had been denied their fundamental humanity. The slave who stole a gun fired shots that would reverberate through generations, announcing that the age of acquiescence was ending and the time of reckoning had begun. In the darkness that followed, as plantation owners barricaded their doors and loaded their weapons, they learned what their slaves had always known: that a system built on violence and maintained by terror carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The master's gun had become the slave's weapon, and with that transformation, the old order began its long, inevitable march toward extinction. The only question that remained was whether that extinction would come through gradual reform or sudden revolution, through negotiated settlement or total war. Elijah had already cast his vote with his stolen rifle, and his answer echoed through the years like thunder rolling across the endless cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta.